morning, gentle viewer. Today I'm going to talk to you about the most dangerous idea in human history. An idea so dangerous to the elites that billions of dollars has been spent to try and destroy, prevent, and otherwise quash this idea, to prevent it from taking hold in the human psyche. An idea so dangerous that it has led to the fall of multiple civilizations. An idea that has been reviled by elites for thousands of years, where elites have actually worked together to destroy it. Where the Nazis and the American government and the Soviet Union worked together during times of crisis to prevent this idea from taking hold. An idea so dangerous to those in power that even those who defined it, who came up with the very definition that allows us to talk about this idea today, who were part themselves of an elite, expressed disdain for the idea that they themselves had created. It's an idea that when you hear it, you'll think, that's ridiculous. We love this idea. It's extremely popular. In fact, it's what the elites are talking about all the time. Not understanding that this idea has been contorted, twisted, and controlled by those in power to prevent it from coming to fruition, to prevent you from thinking of this idea fondly. You have been taught stories going back to your childhood. In fact, children have been taught for thousands of years that this idea was evil and that God will destroy the world if you believe this idea and fight for it. And yet, it has been at the core of movements throughout history. Attempts to create this idea must always be dealt with extreme violence and prejudice, or else the idea may succeed and the structures of power will crumble. This idea has been highly reified and controlled. So when I say the word, you're going to think I must be joking, that I don't understand what I'm talking about. Because this idea has been attached to things that are very much the opposite of that idea. What am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about an idea that we all know fairly well, and that is democracy. Now, before you click off this video, and most of you already have, or most of you never watched or found it in the algorithm to begin with, remember, I'm not talking about democracy as it's been commodified in our current society. I'm not talking about the democracy of elections. I'm not talking about the democracy of having a person in power, or the democracy where American hegemony is extended to the rest of the world, where a dictator, a horrific dictator, is slaughtered by the US military and replaced with a brand new dictator. And we say that's democracy. That's not what I mean. And when I say democracy, I don't mean going to your local library or reading a book by your favorite author and having some freedom of speech. That's not what I mean by democracy. I don't mean vote blue whomever who, or whatever who. That is not what democracy means. The democracy that I'm talking about is a different atomic sort of democracy that comes back from the origin point of democracy and indeed extends back in time before the word was even defined or had a definition that we understand. Democracy, the democracy I'm talking about, existed in places that never heard of that word before. And indeed, the area where this word was invented isn't even the strongest example of its own ideology. Now, of course, democracy isn't the only conflict in history, and I'm not trying to say that democracy is the ultimate conflict, that there is no other conflict than that of democracy versus, say, fascism, feudalism, or other forms of power. I'm just trying to point out that democracy, in my opinion, is probably the most serious threat to elites. Economic disparity is another type of threat. And in a moment, or a little bit further in the video, I'll be exploring how that connects to the idea of democracy as well. So, what is this version of democracy? Well, to get to what I mean by democracy and what democracy truly means, you have to go back to the origin of the word. Not the origin of the concept, which I've already said predates this word, but the origin of the word itself. Because democracy is a word of Greek origin. So one of the first people to define democracy was Plato, demos meaning the people broadly, and the other part of the word, kratos, meaning power or the rule over. Plato's conception of democracy was very much influenced by how it came about through political unrest and through power struggles in the early Athenian system before the Athenian democracy came into fruition. And Plato's primary concern or critique of democracy was that it sort of constituted mob rule towards a sense of anarchy or a lack of moral leadership. Here we have Aristotle, who was partially responding to Plato, and he says at the end of book 3, or at least in the translations that we have, that there are perversions of the ideal state known as monarchy, tyranny. Distortion of politics is democracy. The problem with democracy, in his view, is that it's the opposite of an oligarchy. This is when the indigent, or those without wealth, without property, are the rulers. The poor, or those without power, are more numerous than those with. And those with property, or who own land in the Athenian period, are considerably fewer than those who don't own land. In other words, the majority of people are servants, slaves. They may also be working people or selling various things in a market. They represent the majority. These are the people that, under democracy, have power. That is us. Everybody who isn't at the top of society is in power. Now, why is this a problem for Aristotle? Certainly, this criticism goes against how we commonly understand politics today. The idea that we, the people, decide what happens in a society, and bring us your poor, your sick, all these sorts of concepts. Why does he reject the idea that the people should rule, that the poor and indigent should rule? Well, he has several reasons against this. One is that he believes the populace can be manipulated by those more powerful or more intellectual than him. These demagogues have the ability to affect the populace and to control their thought, to cause them to make decisions that benefit them. This seems to me a rather logically weak argument if we go beyond his conception of good, evil, of moral virtues. Because, of course, the one person most effective at being able to run things their way is the monarch, the oligarch, the single person in charge. If anything, the populace acts as a buttress against the power of an individual, to the degree that there is a democracy. The more democracy, the less power a single person has. And the fact that they are susceptible to demagoguery doesn't mean that they're more susceptible to demagoguery than a demagogue who just is in control of everything. But of course, Aristotle's view doesn't include this conception of the populace, because Aristotle believes that a man of virtue, or men of virtue, should be in control with some limited control or limited democracy for the populace, not the Athenian democracy that they had at the time he was writing. He wanted more control in the hands of a just or virtuous leader, balanced by laws. He thought that laws would actually help us, well-regulated laws would help us mitigate the excessive freedoms of the populace under a democracy. Aristotle is part of a aristocratic culture. He is himself near the top of the ladder, being a philosopher in this period from a relatively wealthy family background, And in terms of culture, he had a great deal of cultural cachet. So for Aristotle, it's a problem if the poor rule, or those without power, or those without income rule. We can say the same issue arise under the Roman period. During the Roman period, there were originally more democratic movements within the Roman culture, but it was philosophers of the period who argued for a more centralized form of control with less democratic form of government. So we can see that from the very conception of democracy, democracy was considered a threat to the ruling classes and something to work against. And is this because it was highly ineffectual, or because it naturally collapsed? Well, in fact, the Athenian democracy was very effective for its period. Well, there's many books on the subject, but you can see here that democracy began around 507 BCE. It flourished for several hundred years, and it essentially ended around 146 BCE. So we're talking about 350 years of approximately, let's just say with all their interruptions, 300 years of Athenian democracy. And were there any successful examples of democracy? Well, that part's relatively easy to prove. I can go through the Iroquois Confederacy. I can look at the French communes. I can also look at the Zapatistas today, who all have fairly successful and varying degrees of length. Like the French communes didn't last very long, but the Iroquois Confederacy did. The Zapatistas have fought against numerous incursions into their democratic movement, but have been fairly successful, even though it's been a fairly short period of time. But we can see various levels and various types of success of democracy, and I can discuss that in a later video. But why and how can I say that democracy was considered dangerous by the elites? Do I have any evidence that movements were made to fight against and that were designed to destroy democracy wherever it raised? Was it necessary, or did democracy just spontaneously destroy itself? Well, here I have to thank authors like David Graeber, like Howard Zinn, and Noam Chomsky, all of whom have examined both the American experience and the international, historical, and anthropological experience of the history of democracy. But there's many other sources as well, both online and in many books, that explain various attempts to destroy, distort, or otherwise co-opt democracy. One of the ways that the Athenians helped fight against democratic reform was with the form of ostracism, a formal process where somebody would be excluded or sent far away for up to 10 years or even more. The ostracism and defeat of Themistocles, Cleon, and Pericles, all democratic reformers in the Athenian period, away from society so their influences couldn't be measured. There were also military interventions and other forms of control. The very existence of that Athenian democracy was in response to public outcry for more power, more equality, and more sharing of resources. So in other words, the existence of the Athenian democracy was itself an extreme response to calls for equality and to end inequality or to spread out power among the populace. So Athenian democracy wouldn't exist if elites weren't afraid of losing power. And the response to that, the crushing of new changes or new reforms, was another response that was considered necessary, even putting their own society at risk by not reforming enough to allow their society to survive future conflicts. When the Romans came to power sometime later, the Romans took elements of the Athenian democracy and stratified it, made it more of something that they could control with slightly more centralized mechanisms. They also had a Senate, but they made sure that Senate was made up of aristocrats, and they also fought against reforms significantly. In the 2nd century BCE, the Gracchi brothers, which I'm pronouncing incorrectly, attempted to reform and distribute land to landless people and to really make greater levels of equality. The elite had a violent conflict with these reformers, killing many of their supporters. So again, great measures were taken. As much or more measures taken to suppress democracy within the Roman society as was to attack outsiders who might invade it. In fact, there's arguments to be made that the collapse of Rome was in part due to the fact that there hadn't been enough reforms to give more popular controls to Roman society, but the argument can't be made that they didn't see the threat of democracy and they didn't take steps to fight that threat. Now, China is another example, a very complex society where there were those who believed in one form of government over another. Quick interruption, just to pause my own video. I do a long section here on Chinese culture and the tensions between Taoism, Confucianism, and other beliefs about power in China. And to be honest, it's a 4,000-year-old society. I don't think it can be simplified in these terms. So I'm getting rid of the rest of the Chinese section. I think it was too simplified, and I don't think it makes a really strong argument. Suffice to say, there was a tension in the Chinese culture between more democratic factions and less democratic factions, but that's not really the primary conflict that existed in China throughout its history. So I'm going to take out the rest of the section because I don't think it's a very strong example or argument. Throughout the medieval period, there were many attempts to create alternate political structures engaging the populace in various ways. You had farmers creating communes and working with each other to distribute resources. You had many guilds that were created that were offering an alternative to the political elite's centralized power. Now, they changed and morphed over time, but the original idea was to create power and a block of power that would stand against those elites. Power that is, by its nature, more democratic. Power that distributes across culture, distributes across society, rather than stands at the top with the pulpit and the crown. You can find these examples many times of these peasant revolts throughout the medieval period, but these peasant revolts weren't just physical threats to the power elite. In fact, many of them weren't really realistically very physically dangerous to the elites. What they were was a threat to the social order that puts certain groups at the top and others at the bottom. It is a threat of power being distributed to the masses. This was one of the core concerns of the battles against the peasant class. And in fact, this is one of the reasons why the whole militarization of knights and of soldiers and distractions like the various crusades were so necessary to prevent the rabble, the lower classes, from becoming a model of power. But it wasn't that they wanted to have one guy in charge of all the peasants and that they were going to usurp the power of the elites. These represented popular movements that would have put power in the hands of the people, and that was unacceptable. As you go through the period, you start to see concessions towards the more democratic populist movements. But these are all responses to political and social movements pushed against the elites. When you look at the American Revolution, the 1776 movement to free America from King George, the movement there wasn't just a movement of free people to fight against taxes and taxation without representation, I should say. That wasn't the entirety of that movement. You have many strong advocates at the time for a more radical form of democracy. You have Thomas Paine, whose publication Common Sense was an influence on the revolution, and which included much more radical notions of egalitarianism and social welfare, and even more democratic conditions than the rebellion actually led to. In England, you had the Diggers and Levellers, who both influenced the revolution and who called for much more egalitarian measures than were actually brought in during 1776. And in 1786, only 10 years later than the Declaration of Independence, there were already mass movements calling for more freedom and more independence from the state. It was the coalescing of American elites that allowed them to create a compromised version of that democracy, which puts power in the hands of a small elite that represent the majority, rather than a more anarchistic reaction to the monarchy that would give power more broadly and stronger democracy. There's a lot of inspiration that was actually taken from the Iroquois Confederacy and from other democratic movements that were already in North America under a different name. They weren't called democracy, but they were more egalitarian systems that sometimes had elders in positions of power, elders being somewhat centralized, but anybody can become an elder when they get to a certain age, and eventually those elders pass away. By the nature of being elders, they're the older people in the group, so they're going to pass away soonest and be replaced with new elders. And there was a real fear at that time that can be seen in documents from the period that the rabble might take control of the society without the elites to lead them and to create a system of law that was enshrined to protect those elites. You also had, within those founding fathers, some notions that the democracy should even be expanded to include, say, black people, people of color, slaves. Indeed, when the slavery movement first came to America, there was a significant problem or a risk, again, to elites from democracy. The slaves, the black slaves who were brought over from the slave trade, they often met white slaves. White slavery was commonplace in the early days of the slave trade. The problem was that black slaves and white slaves tended to realize that they had shared interests, and many of them worked together to overthrow their masters, to kill their masters, to democratize the slave system, where the slaves have no power and serve the masters, to overthrow the masters and replace them with a system where often the various slaves would now be landowners and would work together communally or in some other sort of arrangement that was more distributed in terms of power. And this was seen as a existential threat to slavers. And what was done to fight this was actually to invent racism. Now, I don't mean that before this period nobody hated somebody because of the color of their skin or having a different religion. That would be an absurd statement to make. But the idea of black people being an inferior race specifically was spread and expanded upon by white slave owners by giving special treatment to white slaves, making them more like servants and leaving the more slavery tasks to black people. This led to a schism between white and black servants and slaves that now saw themselves as different. The white people now beginning to see themselves as superior to the black people. There's a lot more that could be said about the invention of racism and how the slavery movement actually helped create new types of racism. But that's not really the point of this video. What's clear, though, is the threat of people working together to undermine the elites was seen as such a threat that new ideas had to be created. And you can see this going back well before the American Revolution. You can see this in the writings of the Bible, where when the Tower of Babel was created, a tower designed to spread knowledge and share the languages of the world and allow people to collaborate, was created, God destroyed it and scattered people throughout the world so that they could not speak the same language. This is a common biblical story. The ultimate message being, if you all work together and come up with a way of compromising and communicating with each other and develop your own sort of agreed upon system where you don't have the Lord and the King and the various other members of the clergy to be in charge, God will destroy you. Outside of the biblical tradition, there are many stories about how democracy is a bad thing. That if the mob gets their way, they'll make bad decisions, they'll be influenced by demagogues, they will foolishly squander everything, and what we really need is a smart, wise, and virtuous leader to make all the decisions for us. This is a particularly prevalent idea in American comics, where usually there's a heroous villain that the heroes maybe have to defeat, but ultimately we all know he's right, that the people are too stupid and too gullible to rule themselves. There's also an equally untrue or risky version of democracy, which is this idea that the only true democracy is the reified form we have in the United States or in France or in these particular countries, where there is a rich, wealthy, and powerful elite who are chosen by the populace, selected a specific member to rule over and make the good decisions. And if you question that leader, then you're anti-democratic. In other words, the exact opposite of democracy. The idea that a single powerful individual rules over us, but we get to just choose who that leader is, that is considered democracy rather than actually egalitarian power to the demos, or the people. And it's from this period in American history that we start to get this idea that democracy is this one version and no other versions could exist. There's many other stories you can think of from this same period, moving all the way up to the present, that tell the same story. If we all work together, we will be destroyed. And that is where the fear of democracy enters into public consciousness. So the American experiment began as an attempt to avoid too much democracy while fighting against a particular authority figure, to fight against one type of control in order to allow a slightly more democratic form of control to take place. The same thing happened in the French Revolution. You have the Paris communes, which were some of the first attempts for workers and generally peasants and lower class people to create their own communities where they would have an equal say and have a fairly democratic system during the early parts of the revolution. But as soon as the elites recognized this threat, they immediately destroyed it. They violently suppressed the Paris communes and destroyed and killed as many people as possible to prevent this idea from spreading. Because even during the French Revolution, this period of great upheaval where there was many people calling for elimination of centralized power structures, there were also elites taking power that were co-opting that battle and turning it into a way to protect their own power. In other words, where democracy and equality are the dangers, democracy, or the concept of that, is reified and is co-opted into another form of elite power. Now, I don't think that this is necessarily me saying that democracy can't happen, because it will always be co-opted by elites. I think that kind of determinist thinking really poorly understands just the vast array of different possibilities out there in human history. But it is definitely true that elites recognized the risk of democracy and did as much as possible to both violently suppress democratic movements and to bring in reforms that would at least quell the masses for the time being. So again, this is a situation where the entire French Revolution is a fight for democracy and a fight against democracy at the same time. Then you have people like Karl Marx, who are arguing that the workers of the world have nothing to lose but their chains. His ideas influenced the battle for democracy in the Soviet Union, or what would later become the Soviet Union, in Russia. When people fought against the Tsar and against those political institutions, there were originally very radical factions within that revolutionary movement that wanted to give equal rights to all workers without a single leader. And it was the Bolsheviks who violently suppressed that. And the risk or fear of the growth of that democratic movement was very palpable. Now, there's some argument from some Marxist thinkers that maybe that was necessary, that the white armies or the armies from the United States or the armies from other countries may have interfered or stopped the revolution from happening if there hadn't been this centralized leadership. I'm not sure I agree with that, but it's somewhat irrelevant to this point. The point is that you had a growth and desire for democracy, and that was seen as a threat, and it was therefore necessary to squash and destroy. And you can see through the centralization of power under Stalin that every attempt to democratize was seen as a threat, and in fact they destroyed and killed as many people as possible who might have had a threat to the centralization of the power under his elite. You also have at this time the growth in the Nazi Party in Germany, who rejected the certain power structures while centralizing and controlling other elite power structures. And it's often forgotten that Goebbels and Hitler owned the majority of media in Germany at that time. They were private owners of mass media companies that had huge influence across Germany. It was only because they were in this elite position that they were able to foment and control the narrative of rebellion from the citizens who had nothing, to tell them that what they needed was a great leader, rather than the terror or the terrible idea of democratization, which threatened elites. Again, democracy being the enemy of the Nazi Party because it gives power to those below. And this is an area where the Soviet Union, the Nazis, and the Americans and many other countries with elites, England, other countries, worked together to suppress democratic movements. A strong example of this would be the Spanish Civil War, which predated World War II. All three factions worked to destroy the anarchists, those that were trying to propose a more democratic solution. It was seen that it was better to have either the Soviet Union in power, the Nazis in power, or some other group in power than to allow the spreading of democratic ideal. In the United States, the movement for Reconstruction after the Civil War was also a time where there was great movements and attempts to create greater democratic social structures, to expand the democracy by allowing slaves to vote, by expanding who can vote, and also by creating more community organizations that might lead to greater sharing of power against elites. But there was a strong and very quick movement to try and prevent this from happening, which is why voting for black people didn't really become legal for years later. And it wasn't, there were people that were fighting in wars for the United States that actually couldn't vote. Again, the threat to the elites was seen to be democracy, the idea that any one of these people, these small rabbles, these ex-slaves, could have a vote and could affect society in some way or take some of their power away from them. So throughout American, Canadian, Indian, British, and the history of elites worldwide, you have a concerted effort to first destroy democratic movements, then the enemy. To get rid of democracy at any cost. And this even extends into modern-day warfare. You can see times where the U.S. has supported terrorist organizations that hated the United States in order to overthrow a democratic government. You can see it throughout Central and South America, where there's been attempts to create more democratic, more egalitarian systems, and the U.S. has done everything in its power to create propaganda against these and also to militarily destroy them.
We'll be our own bosses here, and we'll make our communism in our own manner. Idiots.
I can give historical examples all day long. I can prove that democracy was a great worry for those in power. In fact, in the lead up to the 2016 and 2024 elections, there have been numerous articles talking about liberalism and how it is actually an antithesis of populism, and populism is a threat to liberal democracy. That the populism, that is the idea that the people have a will, that the people, what the people want is what we should do, is actually antithetical to our understanding of democracy. But democracy is ruled by the people. So these are journalists, these are academics who are arguing that the idea that a popular will is itself negative, and the solution for this is liberal democracy. Now, we could argue that people like Donald Trump and other people they're criticizing, their populist rhetoric is demagoguery. It doesn't accurately represent the popular will, and that might be a strong argument to make. But what's interesting is that these articles, these journalists, many of the criticisms aren't about the fact that these people aren't really representing the public will, but rather the problem is that they are appealing to the populace. Instead of saying, our politicians aren't democratic enough, and we need to start listening to the views of the populace, the argument is instead, populism itself is bad. That these demagogues aren't picking up on something that needs to be fixed, but rather the problem is the populace. The problem is the people. So this is another area where the fear of democracy has actually led to the very development of liberal democracy, and they're admitting it. But can I prove that it was the most dangerous, that is considered the most risky, that there isn't a greater danger to the elites than democracy? Well, I think I can. And because we can compare it to other things that have been considered dangerous ideas. And I think you'll find that democracy is at the top of the list. Because surely some of you have been taught the idea that racism is a very dangerous idea, that we can be harmed by it can harm each other, and that maybe the problem with our society is that we are too liberal in our approach to immigration or to ethnic integration policy, and that, but nobody wants to hear that because they don't want to hear the truth. Or maybe people are saying that the problem is really that poor people are just so lazy, and that what we need to do is we need to bolster our strength against them, and nobody wants to hear that because they don't like to hear the truth. In fact, there's many hack comedians that will tell you that the most dangerous idea is their joke about trans people or about gay people or whatever it is, and nobody wants to hear it because they're going to tell you the secrets that nobody else wants to listen to, that everyone's afraid to tell the truth or to hear the reality of the situation. Well, I've decided to look into this more seriously, and my argument is that out of all the most dangerous ideas in history, none are more reviled by the powerful than democracy. In fact, if something was really a great risk to the power elite, we would find that they, instead of acting against it, were promoting it, or maybe just ignoring it, or giving it lip service. While democracy is well loved, and we should expect the power elite to talk about it in positive terms as if they are being democratic, the whole point and purpose and power of co-option is to say, I'm doing this thing while doing the opposite. The whole point of co-opting an idea is to be able to say, we are the ultimate example of this, even though you're not an example of it at all. When we talk about U.S. politics, we talk about that as a democratic state or a democratic nation, where that they've done more to quash democratic movements in the world than almost any other country. It becomes absurd to say that they're the ones supporting that. So is this true for other ideas? Are there other ideas that we talk about but do the opposite? Is there anything where we have a stronger, more vigorous reaction than, say, the many genocides around the world perpetuated against people who are attempting a democratic or egalitarian movement? So I decided to take a look, not just at my own biases, but actually ask for consensus. Now, ChatGPT is a terrible tool when it comes to rationalizing and explaining things, because it really is just a conglomerate of information that whatever the bias in society is what you're going to get if you ask it a generalized question. But I don't really know what the most dangerous ideas in history are. I have some speculation, but I think if I ask ChatGPT for what the most common, most dangerous ideas are, we could explore each one and see whether democracy is considered more or less dangerous than that, using the evidence we've already collected as well as common sense. So taking a look at ChatGPT over here, I asked, what do experts consider the top 10 most dangerous ideas? ChatGPT argued that the first is, of course, racial superiority. The inherent superiority of one race over another have fueled centuries of racism, genocide, and systemic inequality. This is probably arguably correct, true, that racial superiority is a dangerous idea. Indeed, it has been allowing us to disparage other groups and to disempower them. But is it considered dangerous by the elites? Or is it just an area of lip service? The idea that racial superiority is the most dangerous idea facing elites seems silly when the vast majority of them, are white men that purport their own superiority. Many of them are explicit members of white supremacist movements. You can You can also see other power brokers that were in charge of their own supremacist movements at the time. The great, most powerful leaders in the world are fascists. In other words, there's nobody with this more centralized, concentrated form of power than a fascist. But fascists love racial superiority. It's at the crux of their ideology, and they supported it and extended this idea. To this very day, we are still being told that people, say, of Islamic origin just can't be trusted by birth. The idea of racial superiority is baked into our system. To say that the elites consider this a dangerous idea is inherently absurd, since they're the ones that are selling us the idea of racial superiority. In fact, that's one of the ways that democracy was destroyed during the rise of slavery, was by creating a sense of racial superiority that differentiates white slaves from black slaves. So I don't think we can argue that's considered a dangerous idea by elites. The second one here is that the ends justify the means, that it can be harmful to cause, death, destruction in order to achieve some great end. What's interesting about this is that this is sort of an anti-revolutionary statement. This is the idea that if you go out in the streets and protest and block traffic and burn buildings and maybe even kill some rich and powerful people with the guillotine, that's worse than, even if something good comes out of it, it's not worthwhile. That it's, the ends justify the means is the idea that no matter how bad the situation, if you do something bad to solve it, you're a bad person. But the governments of the world wide have engaged in this all the time. There have been massive warfares, destruction of property, destruction of infrastructure, even allowing children to die in the streets of starvation rather than allowing a popular movement to rise. So the ends justifying the means really is just saying don't protest, don't fight, because those things are bad ways of achieving something. Look at all the good things we do, like genocide. The ends justifying the means is a vague statement that has very little purpose, and if it's bad, then we know that governments of the world and power brokers of the world have definitely done it. We can't argue that Hitler didn't believe that the ends justified the means when it comes to his many concentration camps. You can't argue that the ends justify the means with something that the rich and powerful who created World War I didn't believe in. It's absurd to say that this is a dangerous idea to elites, because although they actually want you to see it on a personal level, on a political and global level, they'll do anything to achieve anything. That's just a fact of how government and corporations work. You can destroy an entire ecosystem for one glass of Coca-Cola. So it's a ridiculous argument to say that that's a dangerous idea to elites. What about the idea of social Darwinism, survival of the fittest? Now, survival of the fittest in actual Darwin terms doesn't mean the strongest or the best. It means the most suited to their niche. The idea of survival of the fittest is an absurd concept when we apply it to social Darwinism. But we can definitely argue that social Darwinism is at the crux, again, of the Nazis, of fascists the world over, of the very idea that we need to kill off people who are inferior. The whole attempt to destroy indigenous people, the idea to sterilize people with physical disabilities that has happened throughout various parts of history in Canada and many other countries, just demonstrates that social Darwinism is at the core of many of these power brokers and elites' beliefs. The idea that that we can weed out weak corporations and replace them with bigger corporations is also like a corporate social Darwinism. So social Darwinism is not a dangerous idea to elites. In fact, they love it. They promote this idea, and many of our stories promote this idea as well, that there's great men who rise to the fore and there's those stupid rabble that just have to follow them. This idea of social Darwinism is key to the elite control over society. So it's not something that is considered a dangerous idea. What about religious fundamentalism? The idea that the fundamental truth of religion is the core belief of society and that we need to follow the precepts of a particular God. Well, if you don't say you love God and you're running for US president, you'll lose. The idea that religious fundamentalism is in any way disparaged by the power elite is absurd, because the majority of the power elite, at least in the United States, are religious fundamentalists or people who in some ways capture some of the elements of religious fundamentalism. And religious fundamentalism is behind almost every other regime in the world. Religious fundamentalism basically defined the church-state relationship in many countries for 1,000 years. So religious fundamentalism is not considered dangerous. If it's the wrong one or our enemies' religious fundamentalism, we tend to attack that. But the idea of religious fundamentalism is not in any way a danger to the power elite, particularly because the power elite is fundamentalist. What about the idea of technological determinism? This is the idea that technology frames human beings and we need to follow whatever the highest form of technology is because that's inevitable and our society must line up to that. Well, the current AI craze is that. It's intellectual. They will tell you over and over again that we don't have a choice. There is no world outside of technology, that whatever events and things we have going on in the world right now, we can't stop the march of technology, and neither should we. And billions, if not trillions of dollars is spent yearly on advancing technology that has no clear need. In other words, AI technology, which is interesting and fun to use and might reduce some of our work in the past, is getting billions of dollars to reduce the amount of jobs that people have, to reduce the access they have to services, to get rid of work, but it also is increasing costs, and it's also been used to undermine economies of the world. And yet, it's still something that everyone says is inevitable. The whole idea that Elon Musk wants to go to Mars is technological determinism. Is that considered a dangerous idea by elites if the most powerful people in the world believe it and advocate it? That's an absurd notion, not dangerous. The next idea that's considered dangerous, according to ChatGPT, is extreme nationalism. That's the idea of ultranationalism. Our nation is the best. Well, God bless America. Every nation believes that. I'm not even going to give that a second thought. Elites believe in extreme nationalism. Capitalism as a natural system is considered a dangerous idea by some. Now, I've never heard of this being something that anybody considers dangerous, but this is a commonplace idea in economic, like mass-marketed economic books that basically assume that capitalism just is and cannot ever be changed. And in fact, they will make up stories that capitalism existed before it was even invented just to make it seem more natural. Even critics of capitalism will often make the argument that we just need to make capitalism better because it's not going away. That belief that may be dangerous, but it's certainly not believed to be dangerous by elites, except for possibly within the Soviet Union. Even in the Nazi Germany, which rejected many precepts of capitalism, was a highly capitalist nation during its rise. And in fact, the Soviet Union eventually changed course and accepted some capitalism as well. I would argue that it's maybe true that capitalism is not a natural system, that there are other forms of government, other forms of running the economy that are possible. But that's irrelevant to the question of whether it's considered dangerous. It's not considered dangerous because it is actually deliberately promoted by those in power. What about the idea of authoritarianism and totalitarianism? The idea of total control, of having no freedoms. Well, this is proposed directly by Donald Trump when he says he's going to make it so we don't need to vote anymore. We can eliminate voting. Elon Musk, his department of his Doge area is to get rid of government completely and put him at the top. And authoritarians are the power brokers. They are the elite. So the idea that this is considered a dangerous idea by elites, impossible, because the elites couldn't exist if they thought this was true. The idea of freedom without responsibility considered a risk. This is an interesting one because some would argue that this would literally be impossible. Like, if I say I'm free to run off a cliff, but I'm only if I'm allowed not to get hurt, doesn't make sense. I'm free to do something that will definitely have a consequence, but then I get killed by it. That's not freedom without consequence. If there really was consequence, there'd really be nothing to worry about. Like if I could jump off a cliff and just fly away or fall down to the ground, die, and come back to life, that's truly freedom without consequence, but that's not possible to occur. If everyone had that same freedom, though, we'd be living in some sort of utopia. So the idea of freedom without consequence just doesn't exist. So to be afraid of it doesn't really make sense. It's like being afraid of gravity existing. You can't have freedom without consequence. I think the idea is if you steal a loaf of bread, you should have your hand cut off. In other words, the idea of freedom and consequence is that if you do something free, but then there's a negative consequence, you should be punished for that consequence. Prisons and enslavement and all these sorts of things are necessary in order to protect other people's freedom. And there's some truth to that, but certainly the power elite don't believe that applies to them. In fact, there have been court cases to decide that somebody like Donald Trump can do anything, break any law, and it doesn't apply to him as long as he's president, as long as he's at the top of the chain. There's companies now that are suing people for daring to challenge their omnipresence and omnipotence. So for elites, they don't think this applies to them at all. Are they afraid of it? No, they're probably afraid of the opposite. They're afraid of any consequence for their actions. They're afraid that some action they have might have a consequence. Indeed, many comedians that are so obsessed with saying that everyone's afraid to hear this, as soon as you offer any consequence, no matter how slight, even just saying, no, I don't like that, is too much for them. The next one is the myth of the perfect society being a frightening idea. I would argue that there is no such thing as a perfect society, and that very few people who are advocating for change really believe that a perfect society is possible. A better society, certainly. A society that we can all live and aspire to. Yeah, absolutely. But perfect? I've never met anybody, including the most ardent Marxist or anarchist, that believes that a perfect society is likely or possible. In fact, anarchists often build into their worldview this idea that there are going to be flaws and some inequities that survive. The only people that really believe in a perfect society are those who believe in religious autarky, who believe that when they die, they will aspire to super heavens. But also, it's hard to argue that anybody has spent a lot of money or time trying to get rid of this idea. If they have, it might very well be caught up in the idea of democracy. The idea that if you want any kind of democracy, well, you just want a perfect society. Perfect society is impossible. So in some ways, this is actually a tool of oppression rather than something that anyone's afraid of. If anything, the idea that a utopia is impossible might be a tool used to prevent people from fighting for change. But it's nothing that anybody's afraid of, because it can't really exist. And if it could exist, then why wouldn't we push for it?
Throughout history, there have been other ideas that were more directly dangerous to elites. Things like heliocentrism, the idea that the Earth revolves around the sun, or evolution, the idea that we come from common ancestors, or the end or battle against slavery. Slavery was definitely something that elites made use of. And of course, you have the right to vote for women or other groups of people. Socialism, that again threatens elites. However, most of these only were problems for particular elites in particular parts of the world. Only democracy goes back at least to its foundation as a threat to the centralization of power under elites, and many of these threats can be seen as components of the battle for democracy. One of the reasons why the church was so against heliocentrism initially and against evolution is because it undercut the authority of the church and created a more democratic view where there wasn't this chain of being with one being at the top. This central idea that there has to be one person in charge being central to the Judeo-Christian outlook. You also have the end of slavery being a battle to enfranchise a large number of people, to provide them power, not just to end the economic disparity of slavery. Remember that during this time, slavery had lost some of its initial profit, but there was still the risk that if black people were given power in the society, it would take power away from the elites and distribute them among the people. Additionally, the battle for women's suffrage was sometimes a violent battle against women, but women represented 50, 49, 51% of the population, depending on when you ask. And by extending democracy to that group of people, you additionally undermine the power of elites and extend the power of democracy. If women's right to vote hadn't meant anything, if it hadn't been an extension of democracy, It might not have been the protracted battle that it was. You also have socialism, where you might argue that the Soviet Union was not afraid of it, but they were certainly afraid of the more democratic elements of socialism. And indeed, the idea that democracy or freedom to choose would spread amongst many countries might extend or expand the power of socialism and had to be destroyed. That's the idea behind the domino theory, that people might choose socialism and it must be crushed before that happens. So the fight for socialism is also a fight for democracy. Each of these battles happen in specific times and places, but the thing that runs through them as a common thread is undermining the elites by providing power to the people.
But what about the things that you and I worry about? Not things that are risky in the abstract sense, like certain ideas, but certain things that need a direct combat or we may face extinction. I'm talking, of course, about things like the climate change disaster, the microplastics phenomenon, the death of sea life, the massive number of forest fires. We could talk about massive amounts of poverty, if you like, or if you are concerned about other things, you could talk about like the various sex abuse scandals that have happened across Hollywood and in political spheres, or in some of the other risks of perhaps an attack by foreign powers, or maybe even what about aliens, or the fact that aliens might exist and humans might have to deal with these extraterrestrial life. Or what about some of the things like an asteroid that might be heading towards Earth? And indeed, we have some evidence that there are asteroids that can impact Earth heading this way, and maybe here within the decade. What are the elite doing about those things? Are they as concerned with those things as they are with democracy? Well, the answer for almost everyone is definitely no. I mean, coming back with climate change, we know that elites have actually worked against popularizing or spreading the concerns about climate change. We know that elites took a long time to respond to things like antibiotic resistance and are only paying small amounts of money compared to the amount spent on propaganda against democracy or against crushing democratic movements in other countries. There's almost no sphere where our elites have spent more money than on fighting democracy, and there's almost no danger that you and I worry about, from immense poverty to food insecurity to microplastics, where there has been almost anything more than the smallest amount of lip service and maybe a few $1 million or even $1 billion spent on recovery or prevention costs compared to the billions and billions and sometimes trillions of dollars spent on crushing democratic movements, on fighting wars to support our economic system. There's basically very little done, even by the most liberal of political candidates, to deal with things that we care about. And here's the thing about that. It's also a rejection of the nature of democracy or of populism. Things that bother people, that worry us, are things that they're not doing anything about. And under a democracy, we would expect those things to be at the top of the list. We would be taxing billionaires. We would be making sure that the immigration system was fair. We would be probably allowing people to have different kinds of sex and gender identities that only a small portion of the people think are abhorrent, rather than putting those at the very forefront of our politics. We know that democracy is quite popular because every time that we talk about attacking another nation or about crushing a movement at home, it's because we support democracy. It's this idea that democracy is what we want to protect. And the attacks against it are more to remind us that it's not really possible, or to tell us that really what we need is a strong leader, not really democracy, even though democracy sounds nice. It's a nice idea. The criticism is always to make us feel like it's implausible or wouldn't work or should be replaced with a strong leader. So we have a system where democracy might be something that could solve a lot of our problems. If we had a democracy almost anywhere in the United States where you have like a red state or a blue state or whatever you have, if there is a ballot measure, that is a vote that is on the actual subject at hand, or more of a direct democracy approach, where they want to vote on higher minimum wages or higher taxes for the wealthy or more health care, those things almost always pass. There are some things that I disagree with, which would probably go through in a radically pro-democracy and a radically open democracy. But the majority of things that you and I care about would get considerably more attention under a true democracy. And that is partially why democracy is unacceptable to elites. Democracy undermines the elites, and they cannot allow it. It must be reified, it must be captured and co-opted, or it must be violently repressed and destroyed. Democracy is the most dangerous idea facing elites. The very idea of it can cause people to rise up or to protest or even to create further chaos that might disrupt the plans of elites. If we had democracy, we would be able to shut down all kinds of initiatives that you and I disagree with. Very unpopular things like wars in foreign countries that are pretty much unpopular to everyone would be gone if there was a true democracy. So democracy cannot be allowed to exist. And the one opportunity we have to bring it about is when there's times of great change, times of shifting alliances, times where we start to look at our society and say it's not really working. That's what led the Greeks to create their version of democracy. That's what led many societies to move forward on democracy, is the realization that things just weren't working. So, what do we take away from this? Well, if democracy is the most dangerous idea to elites, then I'm not going to listen to somebody the next time they tell me that the most dangerous idea facing elites is that the immigrants are bad, or that or we can't trust the migrant workers or our fellow workers, or that the problem is trans people or gay people or some other group. Because these are all distractions from what we know really frightens elites. Elites aren't frightened of racism. They helped create racism. They're not frightened of homophobia and sexism. These things are just ways to reify or control or co-opt democracy. What they're afraid of is the people's will. What they're afraid of is that we as a society may take power away from them, even the slightest sliver. So when I hear somebody saying, well, what we really need, what people are really afraid of, is to admit that we need somebody at the wheel who will take control, I'll say, that's exactly what the elites have been wanting to say for 1,000 years. That is an example of capitulation to those in power. And if you don't like the way things are at the very top echelons of society, then there's one way to frighten them, is to distribute that power among the populace. Well, that's it for this video. In a future video, I will be talking about how democracy actually can work as a radical notion. How many societies have existed with strong democratic ties for long periods of time, how it is not an inherently failed or weak system. And in fact, how many of the most powerful elites in the world use democracy within their own ranks. And we'll talk a little bit about how we could achieve stronger democracy around the world.